Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, U.S. foreign policy efforts focused on fighting terrorism around the world. The U.S. launched military efforts against terrorism and lengthy, controversial conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on terrorism sought to improve security within the United States, but also raised questions about the protection of civil liberties and human rights. Despite economic and foreign policy challenges, the United States continued as the world's leading superpower in the 21st century.
All you have to say is 9/11, and anybody who was alive at that time remembers what occurred.
I got an American 11. There appears to be some possible problem with him. He departed Boston going to Los Angeles.
United 175 that just took off out of a thing. We might have a hijack over here, two of them.
Nobody move. Everything will be okay.
We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York.
Another one just hit the building. Wow. Another one hit it hard. Another one just hit the World Trade.
We're putting ground stop on everything. There's a second plane that just hit the World Trade Center.
The whole building just came apart.
Holy smokes.
Stop all departures out of the center, please.
Get me somebody who has the authority to get military in the air now.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Hey, this is Dulles Approach Control. We're tracking a fast-moving primary.
National, you got a primary target heading for P-56 to the west, 10 west, fast-moving, west of your place.
Yeah, stop all departures.
Stop all.
Yeah, went in the Pentagon. Looks like it went in the Pentagon.
Well, we got planes down. We got planes down. You're aware of the explosion?
Yes, we're aware of the explosion. We heard that it was a plane.
The Federal Aviation Administration actually issued an unprecedented order to ground all aircraft in the United States. Everything that wasn't military was told to go to the nearest airport and stop. So we have thousands of airliners and private planes over the United States every day. And the only thing flying over the U.S. were fighter interceptor jets from the Air Force, Air National Guard, Navy, Marines, all up looking for the next wave of attacks. And we didn't know what was going to happen.
United 93, that traffic for you is 1 o'clock, 12 miles eastbound 370.
Negative contact. We're looking United 93.
Here's the captain. I would like to order to remain seated. We have bomb aboard and we are going to back to the airport and we have our demand, so please remain quiet.
We just had another report, United 93, who was in Cleveland Center's airspace somewhere around Dyer intersection, just reported that they heard screaming on the frequency and the people have a bomb on board. The aircraft departed Newark en route to San Francisco was the report.
Okay, the United 93 is 29 minutes out of where?
He's heading towards the Washington area. He was at flight level 350. He turned around at Akron, Ohio, and is tracking toward the Washington area at this time. There is a report of black smoke in the last position I gave you, 15 miles south of Johnstown.
From the airplane or from the ground?
They're speculating it's from the aircraft.
Okay,
I also want to give you heads up, Washington.
Go ahead.
United 9-3. Have you got information on that yet?
Yeah, he's down.
He's down?
Yes.
When did he land? Because we have confirmation.
He did not land.
We went from a concept of just, this was America. We could do anything we wanted. We could go anywhere we wanted. And then one day, just in a blink, everything changed.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
He really issued two types of guidance. The first was the defense of the homeland. He said, look, we've got to defend our homelands. And so we saw in like North Carolina, in all the states of the Union, you saw National Guards troops sent to the airports to guard airport facilities when they opened up air travel again.
This is before TSA. You had security at airports, but not like anything like we have today. And we began writing plans to secure things like our nuclear power plants, because no one knew if this was a larger plan where other sensitive sites throughout the state would be exposed to any other type of terrorist attack.
We would look at the power grid, you know, the water, oil and gas, and then of course we would look at arenas anytime there were large gatherings of individuals.
They were also guarding key road junctions, bus terminals, ports, anything that was a potential terrorist target. When you start to think about it, a lot of things could be potential terrorist targets. This effort to guard the United States was known as Noble Eagle, and it continues to this day.
There was no Northern Command or Department of Homeland Security. We were the precursor to that. And our job in Intel was to actually look for the threat, find out where did these attackers come from? Are there more? Who was out here?
Quickly determined that bin Laden and al-Qaeda were responsible for the attacks on 9/11, even though they didn't come right out and take credit for them. And once that was identified, the decision was quickly made that we were going to either ask the government of Afghanistan to provide those individuals to us, or either we were going to go in there and find them and run them out of the country and render their safe haven untenable.
So on September 20th, President Bush gave this talk to Congress, and he essentially asked for the equivalent of a declaration of war.
We will direct every resource at our command, every means of diplomacy, every tool of intelligence, every instrument of law enforcement, every financial influence, and every necessary weapon of war to the disruption and to the defeat of the global terror network. Today, dozens of federal departments and agencies, as well as state and local governments, have responsibilities affecting homeland security. These efforts must be coordinated at the highest level. So tonight I announce the creation of a cabinet-level position reporting directly to me, the Office of Homeland Security.
Both things were done. In the Homeland Security realm, that would lead to the Patriot Act and a wide expansion of surveillance of people inside of our country. And overseas, it would lead to the global war on terrorism, and that's still being pursued to this day.
The biggest difference in the wars that followed, that became known as the global war on terrorism, that followed, was the question of who was the enemy. It was not a nation state. Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan attacked the territory and forces of the United States. On 9/11, this was not a nation state. It was a transnational organization, a terrorist organization that marshaled the resources to conduct the largest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor.
By October 7th of 2001, we already had this campaign underway in Afghanistan. The thought was, well, it's going to take us a long time to clean this up. As it turned out, it happened very quickly. We ran the Taliban out of Afghanistan. We ran al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. Now, the problem with al-Qaeda was they shifted into the Hindu Kush Mountains. And the Afghans sort of said, okay, we're done. War here's over. Al-Qaeda's run out. But we didn't leave. And the idea was, wow, that went really well. I mean, we got him right away. Questions we didn't ask ourselves. Where was this bin Laden guy? We hadn't gotten him. We sort of assumed, well, the bombing must have gotten him, but we weren't sure. We began to get indications that maybe he wasn't dead, and maybe al-Qaeda wasn't destroyed, and maybe we needed to stay there and keep looking for him. And in addition, the vast majority of Muslims in the world never signed on for the al-Qaeda agenda. In fact, it should be noted that al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and these other terrorist groups, ISIS, have killed many more Muslim people than they've ever killed Westerners. Meanwhile, the Bush administration asked the military and the intel, they said, well, who else out there is a terrorist who can get us? And the big fear was Saddam had been working on nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And so he thought, oh man, if this guy could get an atomic bomb, or if he could get a chemical weapon, which he had already used against his own people, he had them, or worse, a biological weapon. You could weaponize anthrax, which we had those incidents in the US after 9/11, or smallpox, or some other disease that we thought we eradicated, and somehow give this to a terrorist like Al-Qaeda, and they put this in the United States in a place like Raleigh or Charlotte or something like that. Oh man, horrible stuff. So the Bush administration began to say, we can't wait for the attack. And we began to prepare for an attack ahead of the attack. The normal American history is we usually take the first hit, like happened on 9/11, happened at Pearl Harbor. The United States generally does not strike first. But the Bush administration theory was, well, if the enemy's got nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, you can't wait to take the first attack. We shifted the bulk of our effort over and invaded Iraq with the idea of deposing Saddam Hussein. It was over in about 6 weeks. So once again, we'd had a very big victory right away. But the problem with the Iraq one, we didn't really think it through. We hadn't thought it through in Afghanistan. We've been lucky and got a quick victory. We got a quick victory in Iraq, but we thought the people were going to welcome us as liberators, sort of like when we went into France after D-Day in 1944. Well, that wasn't the way we were greeted in Iraq at all. Saddam Hussein's army might not have been very good, and his air force was terrible, and his navy was tiny. But one of the things he had done is he had handed out a lot of weapons to his people. And he said, when the invaders come, they're coming to destroy our country and to destroy our religion and to destroy our way of life and kill our families, so fight back. Well, the people didn't really like Saddam that much, but they didn't like foreign invaders. And so when we came in, the British came in, the Poles, we began to take attacks not from uniformed army, but from civilians with weapons. So it was really a guerrilla type war. And if you think of the history of the United States, we should have been aware of this. If you go back to our Revolutionary War, what was our method with the Minutemen and the militias of how we beat the British, especially here in the Carolinas? I mean, we used our militias to suck the British deep into the countryside and then tear them up. Well, that's what the militias were doing to us in Iraq. And far from having a quick victory, we had a quick military victory, but now we backed into a very long fight against these people who wanted us out of Iraq. And by the way, because we hadn't finished the job in Afghanistan, that began to boil up as well. Taliban sympathizers began to come back. And by about 2005, we had major insurgencies going in both countries. So the quick war that we thought was going to retaliate for 9/11 had turned into not one, but two Middle Eastern insurgencies that we were battling. The type of war the U.S. military was built to carry out was a rapid, decisive operation. In other words, we were built to go into your country in a few weeks, smash all the bad guys, and pull out. We weren't designed to stay there and clean it up for 10 years afterward. And we really had three choices. And these are the same three choices we will face for the rest of the war. We're facing them this very day. You'll hear the same debate all the time. And the three choices are essentially these. Basically, you can turn the war over to the locals and let them do it. You can train their army, their police, their government, and they're going to do the best they can. Now, they're going to mess it up, by our opinion. They're not going to make it look just like, Fayetteville or something like that. It's going to be messed up by American standards. But it's them solving their problem. So that's one solution. Another solution is, well, by gosh, we're just going to roll up our sleeves and send in a bunch more Americans, and we're going to do it for them. Now, that's very appealing to Americans because, we're type A personalities, and we'd like to wade in there and do stuff. So there were people arguing for saying, surge a bunch of troops into both countries. Just clean it up. Kill all the bad guys you can. Fix all the wells you can. Do everything you can. And then turn it over to them. Well, again, you always get to turn it over to them because it is their country and they're not leaving. And the third choice was, okay, enough. This hasn't worked. Pull the plug. It's Vietnam, 2.0 and 3.0. Pull out of here and be done with it. Well, all these things were going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. Horrible hurricane comes ashore in the Gulf at New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. Over 1,000 people killed. Federal, state, local response is not the best. It's screwed up. It's disjointed. Some of those deaths probably resulted from that poor preparation and response. And the thought was, maybe one of the reasons we weren't ready for that is because we had troops over fighting in the Middle East. It's noteworthy that the Louisiana National Guard and the Mississippi National Guard were fighting in Iraq when Katrina rolled ashore. There were actually Louisiana National Guardsmen who had to get off the plane coming back from Iraq, drop their desert gear, and go get their stuff to go bail out the people in New Orleans. I mean, we were stretched too thin on some of our first responders and some of our Guard and military because why? We were embroiled in these two insurgencies. Right now, today, our plan, what we've been doing since the latter half of the Obama administration, is we support the locals. We have about 8,000 troops in Iraq and Syria. We have a similar number in Afghanistan, but the locals do all the fighting and all we do is some airstrikes and some special forces stuff. This has been going on, and both wars are still in a stalemate, but the difference is we don't have 100,000 Americans deployed into both wars right now.
9/11 changed the debate in this country about what freedom is.
On the one hand, we could say Americans, our freedoms ended up being one of our worst enemies because we allow so much freedom to do things and make choices that those who come here to do us harm have those same freedoms.
How much freedom are we going to give up to ensure that security where we can guarantee that you're not going to be subject to a terrorist attack? It takes the loss of a lot of freedom for you to get 100% guarantee that one person can't go out and commit violence.
Well, after 9/11, what the Patriot Act basically said is we're going to empower United States law enforcement, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI at the national level, the state bureaus, the local police, and everything. They can now surveil you all the time. And what they'll look instead for is evidence that you're consorting with some type of terrorist or illegal group. Well, that opens a very, very broad range. I mean, a tremendously broad range. Now, the government does this on the basis that the airwaves actually belong to the population of the United States. We all own them. And so they say, well, since they belong to the population of the United States, when you send a Snapchat through the air, through your smartphone, you're basically using public property, just like walking down the public sidewalk. And just as when you walk down the public sidewalk, anybody can look how you're dressed or wearing, when you send your Snapchat through the public airwaves, we can check that out and see what it's dressed and wearing. What it meant is after the Patriot Act was passed right after 9/11, and it was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, it meant that Americans were subject to surveillance at all times on all electronic means. So today, when you send an email, when you make a smartphone call, or send a text to a friend, all that is collected. Now, the vast majority of it is never looked at. But if for some reason something you sent got entangled with Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, which is another terrorist group in the Middle East, you'd suddenly find a great deal of interest at your door from people. And then they would pursue a warrant to come and discuss with you what was going on. That all happened after 9/11.
The real danger of groups like Al-Qaeda or any radical group, they can use platforms today to get their message across or to attract people to their ideology by using social media, the internet, any number of means where it's just you alone in a room with either a smartphone or a computer, and it can be very appealing with no other voice outside but that radical voice that's right in front of you on the computer. And they have used it to a great extent in the Middle East. And of course there's some good forces that are using social media in that, but I would say to an extent right now there's some radical ideology that's really leveraged that new technology across the world that's a certain threat to us. I honestly hope that this generation or their generation can figure out an effective way to deal with radical ideology that tries to gain its political objectives through terrorism. Because in my mind, we don't have an effective strategy to counter that yet, from my own experience. So I hope we find a way through the new technology. Rather than dividing us, I hope the new technology finds a way to get people to a better understanding of each other.
You can hate the war and hate the policy, but you should never blame your fellow citizens who go to fight, because they go to fight on our behalf. We send them there. You know, if we don't like the war, we only have to look in the mirror and vote or make calls, to do something to change the policy, but don't blame the person who goes to fight. That was a lesson we did learn after 9/11. As much as we turned against the war by about 2005, 2006, polling data even to this day, most Americans would just like to pull the plug and leave the Middle East altogether. But the one thing they do agree on is that our military and our first responders who protect us deserve our thanks, and the veterans and the families deserve our thanks. That's a hugely important thing. A man or woman who's willing to be in law enforcement, first responder, military service is someone who's chosen to do something outside themselves, and it's okay to salute them. And I think that's one thing we have gotten very right in this war, and I think it bodes well for the future, whatever else comes up.